Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. Now we are soon to start the third panel of this fascinating conference. My name is Asher Lubotsky. I'm a scholar of Israeli and African relations. I'm currently working at the University of Houston in Texas, but I'm originally, as you can hear, from here. This panel, fascinating and highly relevant for our current affairs, is entitled The Great Power Competition in Africa. This is, as we speak, ever-changing topic, and I'm personally very excited to hear our four panelists today. Each of them has a super interesting subject. We'll have 15 minutes for each speaker. We don't have too much time, an hour and a half, so we'll try to stick to the times, and hopefully we'll have time for some questions afterwards. And our first speaker today is Ambassador Dr. J. Peter Pham. Dr. Pham rejoined the Atlantic Council as a distinguished fellow in March 2021 after concluding public service as United States Special Envoy for the Sahel region with the personal rank of ambassador. He had previously been Atlantic Council Vice President for Research and Regional Initiatives and Director of the Council's Africa Center. Ambassador Pham is the author of more than 300 essays and reviews, and the author, editor, and translator of over a dozen books. Ambassador Pham is the recipient of numerous honors and awards from African countries in recognition of contributions made over the course of his career to strengthening relations between the United States and Africa. Ambassador Pham holds a BA in economics from the University of Chicago and a PhD from the Gregorian University. Ambassador Pham, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lubotsky, for the kind introduction, and thank you to our friends at Tel Aviv University, the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, and most of all, the Israel-Africa Institute, Dr. Ayman Mansour, Shiri Fein-Grossman, and Haim Taib, for the invitation to be here. It's a delight to be with you today. I apologize for a raspiness in my voice. I think I caught a cold on the flight from Africa here, and so it's in there, but I apologize for that. What I'd like to do is take my time and divide it into kind of four moments. To divide it into four moments. First, if we're going to talk about US policy, we have to define our interests, because I think that's the first part of having a policy. But secondly, then look at opportunities, and then the challenges to achieving those opportunities, and then the way forward. I'm a little critical of the document that was released by the Biden administration in August 2022, the so-called US strategy for sub-Saharan Africa. I have two criticisms of it. One is the use of sub-Saharan Africa, which is one that our African friends really dislike, the division of Africa into an artificial boundary. It's a reversion to the Obama administration's division, which wasn't there in the previous administration's Africa strategy. And the second, more substantive criticism is that it wasn't a strategy. It says that the US has four goals in Africa: foster openness and open societies, deliver democratic and security dividends, advance pandemic recovery and economic opportunity, support conservation, climate adaptation, and a just energy transition. Now, those are four nice aspirations, but they're not a strategy. And how do you order those aspirations if you have a conflict between them? Wishes are not strategies. Strategies need, as many of you who have served in the military know, strategy requires an assessment of what your goals are, what resources you have and the means you have to deploy those resources to achieve those goals. And there was none of that there. I'd like to think that there was a strategy, and there was in the previous administration, which was never released, which is the whole point of it. It was there for reference by those who needed to see it, but remained classified because there are certain things one cannot say in public. But a clue to it was in the December 2017 National Security Strategy, which US law requires to make public. It emphasized that the US had political, economic, and military and security interests in Africa, which were detailed in the classified strategy. So now that I'm not in government, I can speak candidly. How would I assess what US interests are in Africa? Well, first, I would say there's an interest in security remains a top concern. There's no denying. Without security, one cannot have business, one cannot do a lot of things. And security is a top concern. Despite the tragedy of what happened here in October 7th last year, it was the largest single terrorist attack of last year, but the largest terrorist cumulatively remains the Sahel. Burkina Faso alone, with 2,000 people killed in 258 attacks last year in 2023, was the largest victim of terrorism on the planet, cumulatively. The Sahel region itself accounted for 50% of terrorist deaths last year. So security remains very much an interest of the global community. But drilling down economically, and we've heard some of these statistics before, so I'll just run through. If you look at if you follow the IMF, 9 of the 20 fastest growing economies this year is going to be in Africa. So the opportunities to participate in that growth, and I earlier talked a lot about that, so I won't repeat what was already said. But along with the economic opportunities, there's also the access to minerals. Not necessarily to mining them, and I'll get to more on opportunity, but access to supply chains. Now, we often hear the figure that Africa has 1/3 of the world's mineral resources, which is true in the cumulative, but one breaks it down a little bit more. Certain key minerals are even greater. For example, 55% of the world's cobalt reserves are in Africa, specifically almost all of it in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which currently accounts for just less than 75% of annual production. 47.6% of all the manganese reserves in the world are in Africa. About a quarter of the natural graphite, and one can go on and on. So it's not just 1/3 of the world's mineral resources, but disproportionately large percentage of certain very key mineral reserves for the energy transition, or if you like, for future technologies. And then of course there's demographics, which we've spoken about, however, but it's worth remembering that by mid-century, 1 in 4 working age persons on this planet is going to be an African. So the economic interests that are there. And certainly, and I won't belabor the point because my colleagues will also talk, there's the political, not just the fact that Africa has 54 votes in international assemblies around the world, including the United Nations, but also the fact that there's geopolitical competition. Moving on to my second point on US policy to Africa, in the midst of all this, there is opportunity. And I look at that as being 2 trends that come together in a very nice way. One is Africa's desire and that of Africans to capture more of the value chain. As our friends said earlier, Africa is no longer interested in being the exporter of primary commodities to be finished elsewhere. And that's just and it's reasonable. It also, for those who are concerned about the environment, it's much more sensible. I've never quite understood how people who are enthusiastic for the energy transition, and I'm not a climate denier or anything like that, but who are interested in that, can be enthusiastic about shipping minerals on trucks, diesel trucks, 1,000 miles from the Democratic Republic of Congo to a port on the Indian Ocean, where they're loaded upon ships which spew more fossil fuels to take them all the way to China. We won't even discuss how they process things in China and how anyone believes that that is green. However, there are opportunities there to do value added in Africa and to do it cleanly. Cite an example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a Canadian listed company, Ivanhoe, which is essentially, if one admits, looks at the shareholding, is actually an American company. It's a Canadian company, it's traded on the Toronto Exchange, but the share ownership is about 60% American. Mines copper, and it helped make the DRC last year the world's second largest copper producer, and we all know we need copper for electrification. It's powered 90% by renewables, hydro, a little bit of solar in the mix. And the metal is now being loaded onto trains, once it's been concentrated, electric, on the Lobito corridor, which is backed by the US government, as well as our European friends and other friends. So it's getting green, but processing being done, the initial processing there. And we can see opportunities for doing value added, and because the big strategic interest for the United States in this, I would argue, is not so much doing the mining itself, although the opportunity arises, but ensuring that no one country dominates the supply chain. We all know what the one country is, but if we help our African friends do the value added there, then we pay the market price, and the lockhold on the exchange, on the supply chain dissipates. Let me move on to my third point, because I'm aware of the time limits here. So what are the challenges to translating these interests, given the opportunities, to translating them into something real? I would say there are two big challenges for US policy going forward in Africa. One, in a broad basket, is what I call the new geopolitical rules. Africa today is not Africa of 5 years ago, much less 10 or 20 years ago. What do I mean by the rules? First, African countries, states, have multiple options. It's not just the US, it's not just the traditional partners in Europe, many of them the former colonial powers. It's increasingly other powers, China, Russia, we hear a lot about, but regional powers, we heard in the last session, Turkey, Josh spoke about the GCC countries. So there's lots of options on the table for our African friends. And they're going to pick the one that works best for them, at least in the short term, if not the long-term results. Second point I would make under the new rules, first one is multiple options. Second point is the priorities that governments will use will be their own, even if they know that that it's only short term. I had a conversation with one of the new heads of state in my former beat, the Sahel, last year, and he was one of those men in uniform who took power. And he said to me, and I thought it was a very actually self-aware conversation I had with him. He said, Peter, I know what I would do if I had 5 years or 10 years, but right now I'm worried about being here tomorrow, which was a very self-aware conversation. I give him credit for being that. I'd rather deal with self-aware transactional actors, my personal preference, than with delusional ones. I can always transact with someone. People who are delusional or fanatics. I had a very pious grandmother, God rest her. My grandmother used to tell me was growing up that don't trust people who don't talk to God, but run away from the ones who get answers. Sound advice. So the priorities, and what are our priorities? The junta states, regimes for security. Preferably real security to protect themselves, but as we saw in the case of Niger, even phantom security will do in the absence of real security. Anything to legitimize them. Third point I would make under the new geopolitical rules is it's not just the regimes that are interested in regime security, but it's also the people. This is why in the Sahel, each one of the juntas that took power got huge crowds out there cheering. And people don't go out in the heat when it's 40 degrees Celsius to cheer all day because they have nothing better to do. They're actually, honestly, so it requires, we have to acknowledge that reality and deal with them. And then finally, I think what we have to do is we have to acknowledge the rejection or failure, and I think Cyril will talk about one of those, of some of our traditional partners in the region, and we have to acknowledge that reality and work with that. I know in my experience, when I was Special Envoy for the Sahel, one of the things that gave me credibility with both elected governments and as well as the one junta I did have was the fact that I refused to allow the US to join the French-led coalition for the Sahel. And the reason I did that was I knew exactly why he was resented, so I didn't want us to join. But I also knew because, and this is the advantage of being the United States, they could not invite me to the meetings, even if I would refuse to join the club. So I got the benefits of being in the club without joining the club, and that was helpful. So the new rules, that's one challenge. But to be honest, we also have a challenge internally in the US, and that's delivery. We need to deliver on our commitments. Now, it's very nice to hold, right before Christmas, a big summit and invite 50 African leaders to Washington, snarl the traffic and do all that, but what do you get out of it? What do you deliver? And to be very honest, I'm trying not to be political about this, but delivery has been a real problem even when the administration has made commitments. Last May 7th, at Hiroshima at the G7, President Biden announced for the Lobito Corridor, that's the corridor, rail, telecommunications, food security, corridor connecting the port of Lobito on the Atlantic Ocean in Angola, running through Angola to the Democratic Republic of Congo to Zambia. He made a very specific commitment for an energy project there, renewable energy, 2,000 megawatts in the initial phase. He made a specific commitment for export-import bank financing to the tune of about $900 million. Made it himself. That deal was given the Deal of the Year award at the annual conference of the Maxim Bank, and we are now just a few days shy of the 14th month anniversary of the commitment, and that deal has yet to be presented to the board of the Maxim Bank. So needless to say, none of the money has been committed, much less dispersed. So we have to deliver. That's an internal challenge. With that, I'll wrap up to where I see a way forward in all this for US policy. We know what our interests are, we know what the opportunities are, we know what the challenges are. What do we do? And here I would say the way forward, the only sustainable way forward for the United States and its partners is partnerships. And that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm excited by the opportunity, the interest here, your interest, because I think the United States needs to build partnerships both on a regular systemic basis with long-term allies, partners such as Israel, as well as, on occasion, ad hoc partners for one-offs, wherever. We need to build coalition, because we can deliver as a coalition, whether it be a stable one or an ad hoc one, where by ourselves we cannot deliver or we cannot ride in challenging situations. For example, in some of the post-coup states, we are limited, not as limited as the current US administration would interpret it, but we certainly have limitations to what we do on the security front. But we have partners who are not as limited by their own domestic laws or lack thereof. And if we're going to compete against the malign actors out there, whether they be state or non-state, we have to build these coalitions. And I think there are a lot of dovetails, and certainly the vast experience that Israel has in blooming the desert here and many places in Africa, very similar challenges. The resources that the President of Mashab are relatively limited, there are some things that we pick up there, and we've got an experience of that in Ethiopia, where for a number of years we've had a triangular relationship with the United States, Ethiopia, and Mashab, US through US aid, on growing fruits for export. So there are opportunities. That's a nice pilot project, but certainly could be expanded upon. And we also look at some of our partners in the friends in the Gulf countries. Again, their bench is not very deep, as Josh said earlier, but at the same time, they certainly have flexibility in financing and the resources to bring to the table. And so what we need to do is to think in those terms, because if we don't do that collectively, then we surrender the territory and all these opportunities and very much the future to much less friendly actors out there. And thank you very much.
All right, so our next speaker is Dr. Maxim Matusevich. He's a professor of global history at the Seton Hall University, where he also serves as chair of the Department of History. Maxim has published extensively on the history of encounters between Africa and the Soviet Union or Russia. Among his many publications are Ideology and Pragmatism in Nigerian and Soviet Relations, 1960-1991, and Africa and Russia, Russia and in Africa, 3 centuries of encounters. He is the author of numerous articles and book chapters on the role of race in the Cold War and the history of relations between the Soviet Union and Black America. More recently, he has been publishing and commenting on Russia's so-called return to Africa 3 decades after the end of the Cold War. Dr. Matusevich, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Israel-Africa Relations Institute for having me here. It's a long flight, but it's definitely worth it for me. Not sure about you. My presence here, so I'm very grateful. And of course, full disclosure, I have family. Most of my family are in Israel. So Israel is a place that I come to very often. And my mom in Ashkelon says hello to everyone. About 7 years ago, people began, and by people I mean not just academics, began to notice a flurry of articles in the Western press with some fairly panicky headlines. They talked about expanding Russia's footprint in Africa, about Russia building an empire in Africa. And here is just a very small sample of literally hundreds of such headlines about Africa, Russia progressing in Africa, how the world needs to pay more attention to Russia's expansion to Africa, into Africa. And this came on the heels of a fairly long period that lasted for about 20 years when Russia's presence in Africa was not really discussed, and in real terms, it was fairly negligible. So what's happening now? Why all of a sudden, and I would argue it's not all of a sudden, Africa looms so large in Russia's geopolitical thinking now? And as we go along, and I know I'll probably have to rush through images, so sorry for the visual overload, which is probably going to be inevitable here. So what's the secret sauce? What's behind this newly gained interest and engagement between Africa and the continent that in the aftermath of the Cold War, a lot of people, including people in Africa, had assumed Russia had abandoned. Here is an example of a communication by Russia's embassy in South Africa on the occasion of the abolition of Slavery Day, December 2nd, 2022. And I think this very short excerpt from fairly short communication reveals a little bit something about what Russia is up to in Africa. There is definitely an attempt to evoke the legacy of the Cold War, but there is also an attempt to evoke something that the Russians and the Soviets before them did quite often in relation to Africa. That is to point towards Russian exceptional status when it comes to the relationship with the post-colonial world. Basically claiming that Russia had, I was thinking about it, listening to Professor Cohen's presentation in case of Turkey, when Turkey similarly claimed that it had not been tarnished by the sin of colonialism, which of course, very strange claim, knowing what we know about the history of the Ottoman Empire, and knowing what we know about the history of the Russian Empire. But the Russians always claimed they had no hand in European colonial adventures in Africa. They were not tarnished by the sin of transatlantic slavery, and you can see them appealing to them. They were also appealing to the memories of the Cold War. And indeed, as many of you know, during the Cold War, the Soviets made an extensive and consistent effort to uphold anti-racism, for example, which was part of Marxist-Leninist ideology, to lambast imperialism. And these were the ideas that they presented to Africa because they were pursuing a project of creating, hopefully, socialist modernity on the continent, or at least creating goodwill and allies. For example, the Soviets extended numerous and quite generous by Soviet standards educational scholarships to thousands upon thousands of African students. You can see here, for example, African students touring Museum of Vladimir Lenin. Soviet propaganda made considerable effort publicizing Soviet efforts to lambast imperialism and to project the image of the Soviet Union as the guarantor of the post-colonial anti-imperialist struggles. Like this famous poster here, or this famous poster, I assume maybe some of you read Russian, celebrating the struggle of the Angolan resistance against Portuguese colonialism, or presenting to African partners, but also to the domestic population, this idea of the Soviet Union being the guarantor of African modernity. This is an excerpt from very popular humor magazine, which also was an ideological publication in many ways. It was called the Crocodile in Russian. And the image here is quite telling. You can see oppressed Africans toiling under the knut of really nasty looking imperialists. And then the achievement of Soviet technology, Soviet rocket or a satellite crosses the sky. And of course, this image of Soviet technology redeems the oppressed. They assert themselves and they throw off the yoke of colonialism. So very self-serving image, as you can imagine, but also the idea that it's the Soviet Union that is the guarantor of African independence and freedom from colonialism. But then, of course, things began to unravel. And I'm talking about the arrival of perestroika and eventually collapse of the Soviet Union. Years ago, I lived and worked in Nigeria and interviewed a lot of people there, sort of old-style leftists, but also academics and mainstream politicians. I was affiliated with the Institute of International Affairs in Lagos, and I was surprised to discover that many of them really lamented the demise of the Soviet Union, and that's Nigeria, which is probably like the most capitalist country on earth. Why would they lament the end of the Soviet Union? Like you see here, the removal of statue of Lenin, I think that's in Addis Ababa, if I'm not mistaken, because of course there was a spillover effect. And the answer was that many African actors lost leverage, right? The post-Cold War world didn't present, at least to the elites, in some cases, as many opportunities to advance their case, to make their, to have a role in international conversations. And there were perestroika, and again, I'm the last person in the world to lament perestroika. I'm the one of many beneficiaries of the end of the Soviet Union. Otherwise, I probably would have not been talking to you right now. But there was a nasty underside. For example, perestroika opened up a lot of things that had been kept secret in the Soviet Union. One of them was the presence of racism, because racism was not allowed officially. It was there, but it was not allowed. And all of a sudden, all the restrictions were lifted. So people could talk openly about the deficiencies of the Soviet system, about the crimes of Stalin, but also express the most deep resentments and prejudices, and racism was one of them. African students who were sort of stuck in post-Soviet Russia quite often experienced in the 1990s horrible racism. You can see here African students demonstrating in the streets of St. Petersburg against physical assault on Africans by skinheads. So, moving on. Okay, what does Africa? I'll probably have to rush. Has to offer. What does Russia has to offer Africa? So the mantra of sovereignty, something I alluded to before, this idea which is very beneficial to the ruling elites, right? When you come to power and, as happens in the Sahel, right? And you're a leader of a military regime, no strings attached, like in case with Turkey. Russians are not going to demand transparency. They're not going to demand elections, no strings attached, and they do this based on this idea of sovereignty, that no one is to tell you what to do. The mantra of multipolarity, again, return to a world where there is no just one superpower, the United States, no Washington consensus, which again gives leverage to the ruling elites on the ground, but also it feeds certain resentments, which especially in the last, I think, couple of decades have been fueled of the legacies of colonialism, racism, memories of Western domination. The mantra of anti-imperialism, which is connected to this, again here the Russians have the advantage of drawing on the Soviet precedent. No strings attached, again something I mentioned before. Arms mercenary services, again came up this before in case of Turkey, and we talked about Wagner was mentioned. In 2023, 40% of all arms transfers on the continent came from one country, and that country was Russia. And that was apparently a 10% drop because of the war in Ukraine. So Russians have something to give the continent, quite often it's arms. Some trade, but certainly less than the West, China, and the European Union. Some technology transfers, but again, not very prominent. But what's very prominent, and I think it's an important point to make, is the critique of the West, critique of Western liberalism, and the alleged Western cultural imperialism. You will see, and I'll give you a few examples soon, that in the Russian critique of the West, which is projected onto the continent, quite often what they emphasize is this, what they call in America, the woke stuff, right? You heard the term. The alleged craziness of the cultural elites who impose gay rights and trans rights, and for them it's connected to human rights, climate change, completely unhinged pursuit of what they call liberal agenda, and they appeal this. They direct the appeal to societies that are quite conservative, right? And to the ruling elites, which also are not particularly progressive culturally in that regard. So Russia positions itself, and that's very interesting. That's a departure from the Soviet precedent, because during the Soviet times, the critique of the West came from the left, the way the Soviets projected it onto the continent. Now it actually comes from the right quite often. I mean, from the left too, a little bit. But they also position themselves as the promoters, supporters of conservative values. And, the quick point I want to make here that this is not a coincidence. The first grand tour of Africa by a sitting Russian president took place in 2009. And this is Dmitry Medvedev, who was, well, depending who you ask, was or was not a real president, as you all know. He came to Africa almost simultaneously with President Obama's visit. President Obama's visit was very big on symbolism, but really thin on substance. This trip was very different. Medvedev was accompanied by hundreds of businessmen. This was a serious venture, and it happens in 2009, a year after the war in Georgia. So what happens here is that a relationship with Africa becomes a barometer of sorts of the relationship between Russia and the West. As the relationship with the West declines, the relationship with African nations and outreach to Africa increases. As you can see here, Putin hosting 2 now summits with African leaders, and the reality on the ground. This is an image from Central African Republic, where Wagner, the mercenary force, and the Russian state behind it, upholding ruling military regime. And again, you can see here military vehicle with two flags. One of them is the flag of the Central African Republic, then a Russian flag. Post-coup image from Niger, August 2023. Again, Russian flag hoisted by the crowd celebrating the coup. In Mali, demonstrators parading around with an image of Putin. Just recently, in April 2024, rally against U.S. military presence in Niger. Niger was mentioned. The American Special Forces are being forced to leave Niger, and at the same time, there are conversations about the increased role of Russia there. So the Wagner group, I have about 5 minutes left, so I'll have to rush. Okay, 4. Okay, thank you. So I'll go fast because I really, so you can see again, a lot of images overload, but this is very interesting. The Russians sponsored Miss Central Africa contest in Bangui, in Central African Republic, and they're doing this across Africa. The question is why? What does it have to do with Russia's interests? And that's in reference to this conservative agenda, this whole, while the West is promoting gay and trans rights, the Russians, when they appeal to their African partners, they position themselves as the saviors of the conservative traditional values, right? We come from Russia where women are women. And we can prove it because we're putting up those kind of shows. It's a very big selling point. They also try to sell the sort of Russian patriotism, the memories of the Second World War, which is huge a huge asset for Putin's propaganda. Here you can see school children in Bamako, Mali, performing patriotic song. And again, this is in reference to the danger that, from the point of view of the Putin regime, this kind of progressive Western forces, liberal forces, present to the survival of the regime. And when they talk to Africans, they say, hey, listen, we are on the same page. One of the last sanctioned meetings in Russian history after the invasion of Ukraine, you can see Ukrainian flags, but also the flags of LGBTQ community, which the regime connects to the danger, to the survival of the regime in the Kremlin. Here is, okay, I'll probably skip this, but that's an example how one of the main Orthodox nationalist TV channels celebrated very draconian anti-gay legislation in Uganda, calling Uganda a true progressive developed country based on the adoption. So, and the last few things, what Africa has to offer, well, diplomatic support. Russians need it, especially as the relationship with the West deteriorates, especially in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine. Enhances Russia's international image, prestige, improve Russia's standing in the global south. BRICS was mentioned. There is this emerging axis of resistance, I'll call it, which Russia is part of. Military and naval bases, particularly in Eritrea, which apparently is being established now. In Sudan, they wanted to set it up, but now during the civil war ongoing, not clear what happens. Customer base for arms trade, business opportunities for Putin elites. This whole thing is very elite-driven. They are not engaging with civil society, they're engaging with the elite class, and people are making money in the process, but also various influence operations. This person is not with us anymore, as you know. Putin's chief, who about a year ago tried to perform that very strange march in Moscow. Wagner and extraction of gold, also associated with this. And if I can make just like one last quick point, what we're having here is the emergence of very strange, what I call postmodern alliances in the way Russians do their outreach to Africa. This image captures it actually quite well, the juxtaposition of the individuals here. On your left is former president of Guinea, Alpha Condé, who was kind of conventional, old-style politician. He was in his 80s. He didn't want to leave the post. And there were demonstrations in the streets. And the Russian ambassador published an open letter where he appealed to the people of Guinea saying, why are you demonstrating? He's a good president, because he was playing ball with the Russians, right? He's a good president. And your constitution is not the Quran or the Bible. it's a document that can be rewritten or ignored. So that's the message to the elites that they like. Next to him is one Kemi Semba, who is a self-styled anti-Zionist, anti-imperialist of Ivorian French descent. He actually, probably familiar with the name, he was sentenced to short prison term in France for anti-Semitism. And in the last few years, he's become a very common face in Moscow, particularly associated with the person next to Putin, who is Alexander Dugin, New York Times, that loves sort of catchy headlines, calls him Putin's philosopher. I think that's probably an exaggeration. He's a fascist in many ways, and very closely associated with Kemi Semba. So we have this very strange alliance of radical right and radical left, which is captured also here, the last point I'll make, in this image where you see people presiding over a recently formed organization. It's called Afrik. It's a sham organization to monitor elections in Africa. And you can see the sort of the founding members of the organization from your left to right. Professor Jose Matumulane, he is Mozambican, professor of political science and sociology, received his education in Russia, anti-imperialist, self-avowed leftist. But next to him is one of the founders of the most extreme right-wing German political party, not AfD, but the Prussian Alliance, so to the right of AfD, right? So they are sitting together, and that's what the Russians are doing. They're tapping into extreme left and the extreme right and creating these postmodern alliances, which they used to undermine Western influence, but also to reach out to Africa and make a case for sovereignty, multipolarity, and an opposition to what we might loosely call Western liberal values. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxim. Our next speaker is Cyril Bensimon. Cyril is a journalist for the French daily newspaper Le Monde since 2013. He's a reporter for 30 years in Africa. He's now the editor-in-chief of Le Monde Afrique, the service dedicated to African news in this media. Before joining Le Monde as a reporter specialized on Africa, he was for 18 years reporter for Radio France Internationale, where he covered the crisis in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, Guinea, Chad, Mali, DRC, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and Central African Republic. Cyril, stage is yours.
Thank you, Asher, for this kind presentation. Thank you, Pham. Thank you, Cyril. Thank you, Ayman, for this invitation also. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, shalom, good afternoon. And a bit sorry because you will notice that I am French from my accent, so I have hoped to be quite clear. So to start, I was invited here to speak about Europe's African strategy. I'm going to disappoint you a bit, but up to myself, there is no Europe has no African policy or strategy. With 27 different countries in the European Union, with different interests, different concerns, a look which is now mainly focused on Ukraine because Europeans are facing the consequences of war, or even on the Israel-Hamas war for more emotional reasons. The two only real concerns of Europe towards Africa are energetic supply and migration control, not to say endowment. And the latest elections in France with the far right leading the vote are a kind of reminder of that. Up to now, Europe as a union is mainly a funder, not a true political actor. Countries can have strategy by themselves, but when they play in the union, they are just trying to play their own policy on the back of the others most of the time. Energetic supply, what I was talking about, is performed by companies like Total Energy or ENI, which are directly linked to their state of origin, not to the union, for a more general policy. They have their own diplomacy, and like, let's say, the mining business, they are more or less evolving in offshore bubbles that local populations feel excluded from the benefits. Migration control, on the second point, has become For more than a decade, the main focus and probably the only real policy developed by EU towards Africa, not with a large success when you see the results. For example, European Union have organized summits like in Cyprus 9 years ago to formalize an agreement with some African states like Niger or Chad, accepting to play the role of a net for people on their way to cross the Sahara. You have also Frontex, which is the European agency supposed to manage borders, which was created 20 years ago. You see more recently Italy, which has a much more active diplomacy in Africa with Giorgia Meloni. They signed in April an agreement with Tunisia for more than $110 million, where the counterpart is that Tunis is blocking the departure of migrants in direction of Lampedusa Island. With the two rivals, Libyan authorities, it's almost the same strategy. And as you may know, UK has an agreement with Rwanda to send migrants to Kigali after they have been refused asylum. So where I want to go is, I think that Europe, even if it's if the continent is still a real economic magnet for a lot of Africans, is presently losing the battle of the image in Africa. The image that Europe is giving of itself to Africans, and also the image that Europe is giving to African or to the African diaspora born in Europe of themselves. Russia, the new fashionable player, if I can say so, has a very limited offer up to me for the moment. It's security for weak regimes and some mining interest. Russia has understood it perfectly, like Maxim said, and Moscow is winning in many places the storytelling battle. Even if at the end, from what I understand, it's China who takes the economic benefits of this involvement because Russia doesn't have the, let's say, the economic tools to sustain its diplomatic offensive. So more than a European policy as a whole, I'm going to try to focus on what I believe is a kind of cas d'école, if we can say so, over this idea or prism of the lost image battle. Is how France, the big player compared to the other in most of its former colonies, has been kicked out from countries where France was in a very comfortable position, or feel that it was in a very comfortable position 10 years before. Maybe you remember, but in 2013, few weeks after French army was sent to Mali to fight the Islamist groups who conquered the northern part of the country and fled to go south on the direction of the capital Bamako, France was celebrated there. François Hollande was welcomed to Bamako as a kind of liberator. All this was very exaggerated, but in countries like Mali, that has a complex history with France due to colonization, France's image was at its top. 10 years later, French army was chased from Mali, Burkina Faso, and more recently Niger, which is up to me the real strategic country in Sahel, because it's where Orano, the French uranium company, is right now losing its uranium mines. Russia, China, and Iran are looking after it right now. Paris is now worried for its influence in Chad and Senegal. They are sure of nothing in almost of its former African colonies like Cameroon. Some will say that could be the sense of history. But what I believe is sometimes political actors are victims of themselves. Here, France has been victim of a kind of superpower syndrome. It's thinking you are very powerful in a place, you think you know well, due to history, with local political actors who let you believe so, because you gave him the advantage to put the blame on you if it turns bad. In Mali, for example, with the former president of Mali, Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, it was very caricatural. The man was coming from the Socialist Party, like François Hollande. He was elected in 2013, a few months after the French military intervention. And in 7 years in power, he hasn't performed any political progress. But it was very easy for him to reject all the guilt on Paris, because France was at this time the country who said that they were, in a certain way, responsible for the security. They were the one writing UN resolutions, the one who negotiate with the donors, the one who engage other European nations in a military operation, like France did previously in Chad. With all these conditions, it was quite easy for the Malian authorities to say to their population, they are not really in charge, that they wanted to do this this thing or this thing, but France didn't accept, or that they were obliged to do something that they didn't want to. Let me give you an example. In 2020, it was organized in Bamako a forum with all political actors, all the civil society. And at the end, they decided that it was the time to open negotiations with the Islamist group who were operating in the north, as long as they say that their agenda was national. President Boubacar Keïta at this moment said he was not really in favor of these talks. He doesn't believe it can work. But it was not him who took the lead. It was the French foreign minister who arrived to Mali, to Bamako 2 days after, to say that as long as there will be French forces deployed there, it will be unbearable to discuss with terrorists. With this kind of intervention, it's quite easy for the local port to say, we would have liked to try negotiation to conclude a peace agreement, but the French authority refused. And so French became in the mind of the local population the one who blocked this possibility to have a peaceful resolution of the conflict. And in conclusion of that, I don't believe that in Sahel area the problem was really the military dimension of the intervention, which was, by the way, definitely too long, but the problem was more political. Contrary to Côte d'Ivoire, where France intervened also with the UN to solve the electoral crisis in 2001, they arrest the president in charge, Laurent Gbagbo, and ease the way to Alassane Ouattara to become acting president. Here, in Mali, no political goal has been reached. Peace hasn't been reached, and daily life of average population isn't better 10 years after France sent its soldiers. So, present problem of France in Africa, to be clear also, is coming from French President Emmanuel Macron, who sometimes refused to consider some susceptibilities due to the colonization. He loves to say that he wasn't born at this time, he's not responsible for the past. But by saying so, he sends also the message, I'm not really concerned by history when the counterpart is still impregnated by it and is expecting from you the same. When you are 40 in Africa, you can speak to people 25 or 30 years older than you, like you are giving them orders. And when you are French also, you cannot say that history is just the past. The best example is when he came to Burkina Faso, just at the beginning of his first mandate. It was in 2017. And he made his first speech over Africa at the University of Ouagadougou, the capital. He was quite good in expressing that he wants to reform the relations between France and Africa, but when the president of Burkina discreetly led the amphitheater to go to the toilet, Macron just said to the crowd, he went to fix the clim without noticing. He was talking to the president like an employee. Everybody was laughing, but at the end, everybody just remembered that. It creates, kind of, frustration, and you feel that you are insulted. This brings me also to what is maybe not the golden nut, but one of the golden nut of the relations between France and Africa is how do you consider your counterpart? I think a lot of the misunderstandings are coming from the migration policy and the way France is giving a chance to its African diaspora. Most of the visa requests to travel to France are refused now. Even if you are a businessman coming for a few days, you have to give dozens of proofs that you won't settle in France. This creates a frustration, it's evident, and push people, I don't speak here about asylum seekers, to find new partners, or you push them on illegal migration road, which is dangerous, costly, and counterproductive, because a lot of people, when they arrive in the country, they won't return because it's so hard to come. So what France should do, up to me, is to rethink definitely strategy in emergency, and his visa policy first, which doesn't work at all for the moment, and rethink its relation also with its African diaspora, that become one of the main political problems in France when you analyze the latest election result. The message sent by it's dual. It's, we have enough with the ones who will lead the country for years. You hear it everywhere in the world. But it's also, this is the anti-elite speech that you can find quite worldwide. But it's also, the second message, what it's also, we have enough people, not to say more than enough, coming from Africa, which is, I think, a bit paradoxical when you see the situation in France. We are losing more than 100,000 births every year, And so who is going to pay for the retreat system at the end? In conclusion, even if France, I believe, in France's positions in Africa are under threats of new actors, and if its commercial links with the continent isn't so important, it's just 2% of its exchange for $25 billion or $25 billion a year. France is still an important actor in Africa, but to avoid the trap of its post-colonial relations, France is trying to develop its relation with countries such as Kenya and Ethiopia. But I think expectations lies elsewhere. Its image and its place are at a stake where it is expected to be, and it must invent a new narrative with population that can no longer stand the patronage or feeling of superiority they used to encounter with the French side. So, like Ambassador Peter Pham will say, the only thing that people are expecting is deliver what you promise, stick to your commitments. And so in conclusion, if you are looking for some very simple recipes to develop, up to me, diplomatic and business ties in Africa, it's be humble, don't pretend you know, listen to what people say, be careful with their sensibilities, don't try to fix or pretend to fix problems bigger than what you are able to solve. And sorry for my English sometimes.
Thank you very much, Cyril. Our next speaker is Sharon Bar-David. She's a PhD candidate at the Department of Politics and Government, Ben-Gurion University. She was trained as a sinologist at the Hebrew University and Jiao Tong Shanghai University. And Chinese is her main research language. She specializes in politics and policy of the Communist Party of China, and she's currently researching China's involvement in Africa. She's a co-editor of the newly published book, Meeting of the Giants, Reflection on China-Africa Relations. She also published an article in a special issue that I had the pleasure to co-edit by the Arena Journal. I think it was in 2021. So Sharon, the floor is yours.
So today I will focus on China as a major, possibly enigmatic power. China's involvement in Africa in terms of diplomacy, economy, development, and aid has a tremendous impact on the continent and shapes both contemporary reality and prospects of Africa. I will focus on China's goals and activity in terms of influence and development. I will assert that Africa in particular has an important role to play in China's plan for achieving the status of global superpower. Some analyze China in terms of soft power. In my opinion, the term soft power is anachronistic and incompatible with China's approach and activities. Rather, this term, coined by Joseph Ney to explain the ability to co-opt rather than coerce, in contrast to hard power, belongs to a different time, place, and culture. In other words, soft power involves shaping the preferences of others through appeal and attraction. As Ney himself wrote, referring to China, soft power as an analytic concept has migrated and been misused to describe anything but military power, including economic extortion. The Chinese traditionally preferred using practices of economic sanctions and extortion over military power that perceived as barbaric. The Chinese invention of gunpowder, for example, and its perception, initially used for ceremonial and cultural purposes and fireworks, rather than developing deadlier artillery, is symbolic of China's self-image as well as the image it wishes to propagate as a peaceful, non-violent nation with a cute panda as its national symbol. However, violence is a very relative term that changes from culture to culture. China prefer using practices such as economic violence and extortions rather than military force. These practices are perceived by Westerners as softer than military power. However, it is not soft power. Thus, I propose embracing the term influence instead of soft power. Having clarified this point, I will further assert that development and influence are two sides of the same coin. China perceives itself as the leader of the global South, but to perceived by others and its own population as leader, it requires legitimacy. Thus, gaining legitimacy of global South countries is crucial for China in its quest to achieve global hegemony, or at least challenge American hegemony. China's economic miracle was, in fact, very appealing for many global South countries who sought to emulate this rapid economic growth. In Africa, especially due to the disappointment with the failure structural adjustment reforms in the 90s, many African countries sought a new model for development. Western organizations that loaned the money for structural adjustment were perceived as aloof and out of touch with African needs. The loans the West offered Africa was conditioned on implementing democratic reforms and liberalism of the market. Thus, it could not be used extensively for education, public health, social welfare, and so on, precisely the things most required by a developing economy. Then the Chinese came and offered mainly, but not only, infrastructures capable of facilitating economic growth and industrialization, low bidding prices, rapid execution, low interest, convenient loan conditions. Democratic reforms were, of course, not a condition. By doing so, the Chinese seemingly benefited at all levels, external and internal. As you all know, China is facing a serious real estate crisis due to proactive work of the infrastructure and construction sector. China's infrastructure building boom culminated during the early 2000s. China was left with enormous construction sector, much of it government-owned, with many facing large-scale downsizing. With all this attend, social disruption and harm to state prestige. To improve this outcome, China has sought opportunities and sought projects overseas. But of course, this is not the only reason. Africa in general, and the Horn of Africa especially, has an important role in Belt and Road Initiative's strategy. Retrospectively, many of the infrastructure China have built in Africa were designed to benefit China rather than the locals. Improved transportation and supply routes granted the China access to Africa's natural resources as well as markets suitable for China low-quality processed products. Thus, rather than helping Africa replicate Chinese development model, it is in fact replacing an earlier unsustainable model one used by Western colonialists to develop their own industries while transforming Africa into a beholden source of natural resources. The 240 special economic zones that were built by China in Africa were designed to favor the Chinese interests of gaining cheap labor and avoiding American sanctions on Chinese products. In retrospect, these initiatives were not profitable and made little contribution to the host African country's economy. To conclude, China's main aspirations in Africa is to gain legitimacy as the leader of the global South countries. One of the main tools that is to attract African countries to embrace Chinese model for development. By doing so, China seeks to ameliorate some of the internal problems and mitigate social turmoil. African countries that found the China model appealing and sought to apply it in their countries actually received an unsustainable model. The physical BRI is only the first stage of the big connectivity plan. Now China is shifting towards a digital Silk Road as the second stage of the connectivity plan. In addition, there is a certain perception among China policymakers that is incrementally gaining popularity. Africa has not passed the stage of industrial revolution. However, this stage is not crucial for development. Africa can skip this phase and move directly to the digital revolution. Currently, African territory is a battleground between communication giants bidding for projects to establish network infrastructure. ZTE and Huawei are the influential actors, especially in Horn of Africa, competing with Western Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. China's vision to establish the global network that will be connected to China as the core with the information installed in Chinese servers, and China will dominate the data. This aspiration raised many questions. Though the risk of espionage is the most luring widely covered in media, this is only a narrow angle. The two main benefits for China from this plan is gaining political influence and commercial advantage. According to the Chinese vision, the infrastructure phase was established in order to facilitate the flow of goods from China to Africa through the Horn of Africa. The next necessary step is to provide accessible internet to insert online commerce platforms, thereby further strengthening China's commercial advantage. Another aspect is the political influence. This is a very complex, multidimensional issue. Africa is a vast, growing, and largely unpenetrated market of approximately 1.4 billion people. In 2021, the internet penetration rate in Africa was 22%. It has huge potential for China's applications and social media platforms. If China seeks to challenge the West, securing a larger share of the African market, the technology is a very powerful agent for influence. It shapes our opinions and perspectives from the commercials presented to us to the algorithm selects the contents that we are exposed to. In this way, China can influence our personal preferences, political opinions, and even spark riots against the regime. China is also encouraging African countries and municipalities to purchase smart city tech. Of course, these technologies bring with them many advantages. However, they are designed for the Chinese regime. This technology includes features designed to track the movements of every citizen in order to rank him in the social ranking system that is currently used in China. How many African countries will embrace this tantalizing option? How will its implementation affect human rights and civilian liberty? The Digital Silk Road offers both opportunities and risks for Africa. African states should carefully analyze and establish policies that will counter these threats. African states should be aware of the risks and consider what level of cultural penetration would truly benefit their long-term interests, acting through the framework of the African Union to defend their common interests. China needs Africa, and Africa can therefore shape the terms of its relationship with China to its advantage. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much to our four panelists. We covered the four, I think that's the four major superpowers, right? Active, most relevant to Africa. And now it's time to take some questions from you, the audience. We have over 20 minutes, which is a nice time. I think what we'll do is let's take rounds of 3 questions each. So we'll have 3 people ask, and then we'll let the panelists answer. And then if we have more time for another 3, we'll do that too. All right, so whoever has any question? And let's just take one more question. And sir? Yes, sir. You're welcome. All right, we have 4 great questions. So whoever wants to start answering it.
Okay. I'll try and weave some of them together. So being with the ambassador's question, my first point when I said that there's a new geopolitical rules was that we have to respect the fact that African countries not only are independent, but they have options. So the options we offer, whether any outside partner, has to be attractive. If you can't offer a better proposition, you're going to lose every time. So you have to respect that. And which is why my second point was that I think the strategy going forward for the United States, our other partners, is to build partnerships that collectively can offer a more compelling value proposition than our competitors. We have strengths, our Israeli friends have strengths, our friends in the GCC have strengths. I mean, there are transactions I'm aware of that don't necessarily make the front pages, but are going on that are involve actually some of the GCC countries working closely with the U.S. to, move into and finance some projects or dilute shareholdings. And so there's a lot of room, and I think this is where flexibility and a little bit of pragmatism are important. To the question about what I anticipate after the U.S. election, let me answer it in 2 phases. One is, irrespective of whether President Biden is reelected for a second term or President Trump is elected, there will be some change in management. Tradition that's always happens in a second term at the State Department, other departments. And so personnel is policy, they say, and certainly certain personnel will no longer be around, and that in itself will be an improvement. I won't name names, I don't think people who cannot speak French should go to French-speaking countries and shout at generals. Usually not effective as a coping strategy. As far as what changes will occur, full transparency, I served in the Trump administration. I advised the Trump campaign. You know, I won't say who wrote the classified strategy, but there will be a strategy again. That will be the big change if there. And I'll stop there.
Okay, just the question about how other powers sort of competing for the soul of Africa, as they said, during the Cold War, how they're dealing with each other. I'm actually not familiar. I don't think the Chinese and the Russians actually cooperating that much. They are pursuing very different agendas. What's happening, and again, you probably know more about it, what's happening in terms of Chinese presence in Africa, a lot of this is state-driven. The Russians too, but also it's elite-driven. So if you look at the people, you know, I mentioned Prigozhin, you know, I mentioned a couple of other people, I didn't have time to discuss them, people like Malafeev, the billionaire. They're a very interesting bunch. Many of them are staunch Russian nationalists and even kind of traditional imperialists. Also, a number of them, like Malafeev, who is the owner of the TV channel, very kind of right-wing conservative, orthodox religious TV channel, you know, who is involved in the outreach to Africa, by the way. You know, they are committed to A, Russian nationalism, B, to their business interests, you know, and I'm not sure in which order this comes. So quite often what happens when Russians come to Africa, and we saw that with Wagner, with Malafeev, with some other actors, they quite often represent business interests of the elites close to Putin. You know, sometimes Putin's in the circle. And I don't think that's the case with China at all. So I don't know how these guys interact with the Chinese. I don't think they do a lot. Also, they're not nearly as involved in African economies as the Chinese are. You know, the Chinese, you know, build, you know, rail links and light rail and residential buildings. The Russians are not doing that. You know, it's extraction, mercenary services, and, you know, arms supplies, right? So the question about whether or not Africa is independent, I think what we're discussing here, what we're seeing is that Africa indeed is independent. And that's why there is this competition now. You know, that's why the Russians are, you know, and I can speak a little bit more expertly about Russia, why the Russians are investing so heavily in their relationship with Africa, because they really desperately need those African votes, for example, in the United Nations. You know, I have a chart that I don't have time to share to show how African nations vote on Ukraine, for example, resolutions. And there is a dividend there for Russia, right? But they're not demanding this, you know, they're sort of trying to make a proposition to appeal to the elites, to appeal to African sentiments, to appeal to the memories of the Cold War and memories of imperialism, frankly, in order to gain out of African states what they need most, you know, which in this case is friendship, because they're losing elsewhere, but also support in international fora. So I think this points towards actually a recognition of African agency, you know, and that's why there are those efforts by the big powers to, you know, to make nice to Africa, to position themselves in such a way that they can develop those relationships. You know, that's how I see it.
Well, any other comments from?
Sorry, this one, okay. So I agree that China and Russia, in regards to Africa, they pursue completely different goals. In general, China tries to solve its internal problems by exporting them to Africa. And the second reason is because most of the economic activity between China and Africa are run by municipal level companies, and they don't have the business platform or the motivation to cooperate with other businesses. So,
yeah. Okay, so to make it fast, for what I see, I'm seeing that Russia is looking for influence. and China is looking for economic benefits. And sometimes it doesn't work together because Russia is meddling in political affairs. China always refuses to meddle in political affairs. Or if they are meddling, they are doing very quietly and saying, we don't want to. Russia really expressed it. We are here to support you. We are here to help you in a hard situation, and we will have a partnership based on that, which is very different, and sometimes it can't work together. And if you see in some countries, for example, Central African Republic, sometimes there's real tensions between China and Russia, because sometimes it could be Wagner guys who enter and try to take a mine which is not of a big importance, but which is operated by Chinese. So of course it creates tension between them.
All right, final questions, anyone? We maybe have time for one or two.
I think it's, of course, nobody intervened for nothing. It could be for influence, it could be for economic benefit, it could be France has done it because they have the belief that by intervening or going to in political affairs in Africa, they were in a way conserving a role of power, at the UN and so on. Nobody does things for nothing, for sure. But at the end, it would be from the African to create powers. It could be regional powers. It could be countries which are developing, like South Africa or Nigeria, or even, for example, Rwanda, which is a smaller country, which you can see on the diplomatic scene. We create, a kind of partnership where you're equal to equal. But if you ask for the other to treat me as an equal, but I'm smaller, you can wait for a long time.
I would add to that amplify what I said earlier. I think there is a synergy between what Europe and America are seeking in terms of access and what Africa wants, which is capturing the value chain. And this is in particular with the extractive industries and mining. The fact is, notwithstanding the delusions of bringing everything home by certain politicians back in America, the fact is we're incapable of wanting to mine our own resources or process them. It takes, in the U.S., from discovery of a mineral, if you're lucky enough to get it approved, 15 years to open a mine, if you get to do it. Processing plants, forget it, good luck. It's not going to happen. So realistically, what we're seeking, if you think about it rationally and coldly, is access to the minerals, not necessarily capture. And so where can you process? Africa should get the value chain. And they shouldn't be shipped, as I was saying earlier, put on trucks, diesel trucks, and shipped 1,000 miles from Congo to Durban and put on a boat. The processing should be. So there's a win-win in there for Africa doing its processing, capturing the value chain, and putting it on the market, not giving it away, putting it on the market, whatever the global market spot price is. If you want it, you're going to have to pay the price. And just access is the key. That's one example. But the other is Africa, it's not enough to demand a seat at the table. One has to come prepared. And this is where very often, I've seen it myself, and I think others have, whether they be in business or in diplomacy, that very often, unfortunately, some of our African partners, some are very, very well, extraordinarily well, but many come to negotiations ill-prepared, without a strategic vision, and very often that's where you're taken advantage of. And so, that's the other part of it. I think of, this coming fall will be the triennial FOCAC Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Beijing. And most of the African countries will be there at the head of state level. And Xi, to his credit, will meet with every delegation. And he's probably had a team of 12 to 24 people preparing for that one meeting with, so he'll be extraordinarily well prepared for the meeting. Even if you're the president of a microstate, he'll be prepared for it. I wonder if the counterpart is as prepared for that meeting. And that's a different question that Africans have to ask their leaders.
All right, this is the end. Please join me in thanking our 4 panelists. Thank you very much.